Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. No prayers, no buffalo speeches, and no spirituality shows. While this podcast does not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do take a tough look at history, oppression, and our survival. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Say hello and welcome to Let's Talk Native. I am John Kane. I'm your host, and I want to talk about something that is, look, I was listening to NPR the other day, and I heard a report that suggested, based on polling, that 40% of Americans don't know that Native people still exist. So I'm here to say we are still here. Now, having said that, I don't want to be, sound ridiculous, because I know a lot of people know that we exist, and apparently 60% do. And if you live near Native people, near a Native community, or if you know somebody who's Native, then obviously you are not necessarily in the same group of people who are that oblivious. But even if you do live next to Native people, even if you have a Native friend or live next to a Native territory, you may still not understand who we are, or yes, we still exist, but in what state do we exist? I mean, in what condition do we exist? And so I want to talk about that a little bit. And it isn't just going to be about doom and gloom. It's about explaining the spectrum that that Native people live as, in terms of who we once were versus who we are today. And in talking about it, part of it is out of my concern, and I've talked a lot about identity on this show, and so this is a little bit of that. But after 500 years of genocide, after hundreds of years of assimilation, and when I say assimilation, I mean literally ethnic cleansing. This idea that we would at one point be exterminated. I mean, look, when I say we're still here, that wasn't the plan. The plan wasn't that Native people would always exist. That's not what was in, part of the American plan, the manifest destiny. It wasn't all about incorporating us into the fabric of American society. No, that wasn't the plan. The reality is there was an expectation that if you wiped out enough of us, the rest of us would just disappear. We would just fade away. We'd die out. And, there are many people who believe that Native people have died out. And that's, that not just that 40%, but even among the people who know we exist, they think we exist in the same way that, somebody who opens up a pizza shop says that they're Italian. So, yeah, they're not really Italian. They have, ancestry, that includes, Italian heritage, but they aren't a citizen of Italy, and they aren't of the Italian culture. They just maybe have an I at the end of their name, or they've got a couple of family recipes that they handed down. And so that can be said about a whole lot of people who, this notion of nationality. What nationality are you? Well, look, most of the people who answer that question answer it based on, something their parents told them. And so how do we exist? And I have to start by saying first that Native people are not a monolith. We never were. And we were always a very diverse population. We had certain things we held in common, and our connections to the land were among those things. There were literally hundreds, if not over 1,000 languages. Today, the federal government claims they recognize 575 federally recognized tribes. Well, those numbers are a little fuzzy because you look at some that have been separated, and I think about the Seneca Nation. There's the Seneca Nation, but then there's the Tonawanda Senecas, and then there's the Cayuga Senecas out in Kansas. Many Native territories have been separated by the removal policies, and so rather than looking at Mohawk Nation, for instance. I'm Mohawk. Well, the federal government doesn't even recognize Mohawks. They recognize the St. Regis tribe of Mohawks, which is a very small subset of Native people who claim to be Gunyagahaga, who claim to be Mohawk. And of course, there's border issues and all kinds of other stuff. But so when I hear the number, I don't know what they're calling a tribe, band, or nation of Indians in terms of in terms of those who would identify specifically by those designations. And this is, kind of where we're at. There have been, paid professionals. There have been legal counsel and lobbyists and all these others who have described Native governance within the context of the system of both U.S. and Canadian federalism. That somehow we are a division of their system of governance. So there's a federal government, the state government or provincial government, there's counties, there's townships, and somewhere in the mix there are those that believe that we have been municipalized, I guess, or fit within the division of that system of federalism. Our governments are a part of their system. And that's not necessarily true. On the Canadian side, a lot of the band councils, they certainly qualify for that kind of description. But again, there's the band councils, but then there's the people that the band councils claim to represent. And I've cited this oftentimes. I've talked about how in Six Nations, I think it was only like 5% of the population votes in those band council elections. Well, it's a little hard to suggest that somebody who's elected in a band council election on the Canadian side, where there's only 5% participation, that you can even really claim that those governments are legitimate. But most of that legitimacy comes from the relationship with Canada. But that's them as an administration, as an entity, almost like a corporate entity. It's not necessarily all the people. So when somebody asks about being Native, it's a complicated answer. It's a complicated question. And as I've looked at, as I've traveled, as I've gone from territory to territory, and I've interacted with people, some that are quote unquote not federally recognized, some that are state recognized or not state recognized, some people who have lived in the same lands since time immemorial, and yet they are not distinguished by the United States as a recognized tribe or whatever else. And I don't have a problem with not being recognized. I mean, in fact, I'm not an enrolled member of the St. Regis Mohawk tribe, but it doesn't stop me from being Mohawk or Gunyagahaga. So again, a lot of these designations, we get caught into the confusion over this stuff. So when I say, yes, we are still here, but then the next question is, but what are we? Well, that what are we can be complicated. Because like I said, there are lots of people who have fully accepted and embraced American citizenship or Canadian citizenship that are Native people. Now, there's a certain conflict in saying that. I mean, because how do you define being Native? Well, is it just blood quantum? Is it ancestry, or is it the life that you live today? Because that's where some of this stuff gets confusing. And because there has been such an effort not only to eliminate us from the beginning, but then eliminate us through attrition or through assimilation, hoping that we would all marry out or either get absorbed into some of that melting pot of American society or Canadian society. So whether we there's the whole race mixing thing of Native people intermarrying with other peoples of color or white people. And so does it water us down to the point that we cease to exist as a distinct people? Well, look, there's always going to be Native people who resist assimilation and who are going to try to maintain not only their sovereignty, their authority over their being, but maintain a certain level of cultural integrity. Look, it's not to say that we're like Amish and we're going to live in a frozen state of cultural development, so to speak. No, it's not that. It's about bringing all of that stuff forward. Even as we speak English, we hope to maintain our languages, and we're doing a fairly decent job doing that. I mean, compared to the amount of language loss that we saw, say 30 or 40 years ago. So there is a lot of there's a lot of effort being put in by some to maintain Native distinction. Now, almost nobody wants it to totally go away as far as Native people. So whether you're a band counselor or you work for a tribal council that's a federally recognized tribe or whatever else, you almost can't let it completely go away, because then the whole idea of being a band or a tribe or a nation of Indians subordinate to the laws of the United States, you don't even carry that distinction. So if we look at the Native population, it's a little hard to put numbers to it, and I wouldn't even attempt to do so. But you're gonna acknowledge that there are plenty of Native people who have fully embraced an American life. And on the other side of that imaginary line, a Canadian life. And look, many Indigenous people who got caught up in the colonization of Spain, by Spain. So they've adopted a lot of Spanish culture, but not just the language, but the religion, and there's oftentimes a little bit of a melding of cultures that come from the colonial states. And yet some of what we hang on to. And that's where most of us are. And almost nobody can say that they're living the exact life of a people who would have never had contact. That probably doesn't exist. Now, and I'm not saying that's a requirement. And I'm not even saying that that's necessary or that's in the best interest of preserving who we are. Because look, we live in a world where the actions, all of our actions affect each other, regardless. We can't claim to be, in tune with the environment if we're going to ignore the fact that our environment includes an awful lot of white people and non-white people. So our environment has changed, and a lot of that change is due to population growth and again being inundated with people who've basically taken over, so to speak. Now, I think it's really important that we encourage those people in our communities, across from territory to territory, who do really attempt to maintain a high level of cultural integrity and cultural distinction, language, storytelling, understanding the history, the oral history. I think all of those things are really important, and I think, even if you are one of these people who wants to enlist in the armed forces and they want to vote in American elections and they want to, incorporate all of these, these colonial systems into their being as a Native person, even if you're that person, you should still be glad there's somebody maintaining a little bit more, or certainly more of that integrity, of that cultural consistency, because that's what we're all going to rely on. At some point, we're always, the more we get sucked into this, assimilation whirlpool, the less resources we're going to have around us to draw to. And look, I look at what my generation, the generation that I'm part of, and I'm 61 years old now. I look at how much my generation and the people who are just slightly older than me, how much they retrieved from what was lost or what appeared to be lost. And so let me explain. You can look at pictures of our people in the 50s and the 60s who look like we're dressed as Plains Indians. We've got long headdresses on, and we're participating in some level of some sort of cultural activity, social activity, maybe ceremony. But we had already gotten affected by the Hollywood image and what people perceived as what a Native person was, and we bought into that. It's been since then that we understand what a Gostoa is. What we understand the three feathers, mean and signify. What certain parts of our culture have come to mean. We have a better understanding because we've had the people who understand the language, who didn't let it fade away, not just as table talk, talking about passing the salt or the milk or something, but understanding where the words come from. And so there's been an education. Look, the sovereignty movement, for lack of a better word, the movement that includes AIM, includes the warrior societies, coming back into existence. Those who are fighting for our distinction on our territories, fighting for our regulatory advantages, our right to develop economies and that kind of stuff. We had to learn much to advance that stuff. It wasn't enough. We couldn't just do what we wanted and not think that we weren't going to be challenged from the outside. So to meet that challenge, we had to educate ourselves. So we had to educate ourselves about U.S. law, Canadian law, and where those limits to those laws are. I remember, one of the organizations here in the Seneca Territory invited a lawyer a lawyer that they thought was very knowledgeable about, fighting for our rights and that kind of stuff. And they talked to the lawyer about his knowledge of Indian law. And he said, let me clarify here. I'm not an expert in native law. He says, my job is to find out where U.S. and state law have been abused and that they've been stretched beyond their legal limits. So when I get involved with fighting, defending a native person, what I'm fighting against is the U.S. or the state laws, the federal or the state laws that are being applied wrongly. So he says, but if you want to know about native law, and he pointed back to me, he says, talk to that guy. I've learned more about Indian law, native law from him, and he was pointing to me. So it's a little self-serving story, but he was pointing to me. But what he was explaining is that you should know your laws and your culture and where authorities lie and where they don't lie. You should know that. Don't look to a white man with a briefcase to tell you that. He goes, what I'm going to do is defend you because the laws are being inappropriately applied to you, and or they don't apply to you at all. So this is the stuff that we've had to learn. And look, we sometimes have had to educate the lawyers. And that's what, this lawyer was expressing, that if he didn't have some native resources to raise the challenges, he wouldn't have known how to defend it. So it's on us to know a little bit about what we're facing and also what our defense. Look, I once said the phrase, sovereignty isn't our defense. It's what we defend. So it's not enough to say, well, we're native, that your laws don't apply. No, we've got to fight for that distinction. Now, we're not all fighting the same battle. And that's why I say when I ask that question, what are we? Well, because even these band councils and these tribal councils, they get in a tough situation because, there are certain laws that the U.S. passes, and we utilize those laws to perhaps further our economic growth or whatever else. And I'll give an example. Up in Akwesasne, the St. Regis Mohawk tribe built a casino. And they built a casino because when they passed the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, a federally recognized tribe could open up a casino if they entered into a gaming compact with the state and all of this, right? So that's the direction that the St. Regis Mohawk tribe had gone into. But at some point, there was a challenge about OSHA laws. So when we open up something, when we open up a business on our territories, and we're doing it under some federal, state or federal law, that even if it's a law like IGRA that was carved out specifically for us or to us, whatever, however you're going to call it, when we operate under the authority of that law, what we're doing is we're operating under the authority of the federal government. So this challenge that occurred in Akwesasne over whether OSHA's laws could be used, these are the occupational, these are hazard laws essentially, it could be enforced in a casino. The St. Regis Mohawk tribe, their lawyers, tried to use some of the treaties for defense, the Canandaigua Treaty. So he tried to use some treaties, and it was a strange slap in the face that came back to the St. Regis Mohawk tribe. They said, "You're not a party to those treaties." So what they were told is that you have used the Seven Nations treaties and some of these other treaties that are not necessarily the Six Nations, and you are not representing yourself as the Mohawk Nation, but as a creation of some other set of relationships. You've never provided us with any evidence that you, as the St. Regis Mohawk tribe, are a legitimate party or even really legitimate heirs to the party that entered into the Treaty of Canandaigua. That was quite a slap in the face. And, and it said something. It said something to those of us who worry about band councils, tribal councils, elected councils, claiming so much of our culture on one hand, but also claiming all of the perks that come with being a federally recognized tribe, using federal laws, participating in all of their regulatory systems. I mean, even today, as I talk about some of this stuff being complicated, look, we have casinos in some of our territories because we have the right to have casinos, but we don't. We operate them under a federal law, and so we have these casinos. But we also have some other businesses that we operate. We operate these tobacco retail. And we argue that the state doesn't have the authority to regulate our sale of tobacco. And we take that argument, and then in our stores, even in the casinos, we sell cigarettes without New York State's tax on it. However, when we sell booze at those casino bars, we have a New York State liquor license. Look, I'm sorry to say it, but that's thin ice there, and it's a slippery slope. So if we're going to make the argument that the state law doesn't regulate our tobacco sales, but they do regulate our alcohol sales, and we concede to that, see, this is where this gets very, very complicated. So even as somebody asks me the question, look, there are a lot of non-native people who believe that we are sovereign nations and that it's kind of like nation within a nation kind of thing. Well, the problem with that, and I've talked about this on a couple of shows recently, we don't have the same understanding that the federal government or the state governments have. And in fact, while there's some places that the states will acknowledge they don't have certain authorities, they will never say that there is a place where their jurisdiction or the sovereignty of the state stops and ours begins. There's never that line in the sand. I mean, we've drawn lines in the sand and said, no, you're not coming on. You're not doing this. You're not doing that. We've done that, and we've done it over tobacco. We've done it over other issues. But we can't say that the state or the federal government recognizes our sovereignty if they don't recognize that there's a limit to theirs. And so this is where it gets really complicated. There are people at the grassroots level who are always willing to say, hell no. But tribal counselors, people in elected office, they oftentimes try to walk a line that suggests, yes, we can be both. In fact, I've talked about it before, this myth of dual citizenship. And that one cuts a couple of different ways. Not only do we have this some people who promote this belief that I can be a citizen of the Seneca Nation and be a citizen of the United States at the same time. Well, no, it doesn't really work that way, especially if the United States doesn't recognize you as a citizen of the Seneca Nation, but they merely recognize you as a member or an enrolled member of a tribe. And then I've heard other people try to say, well, the dual citizenship thing comes into play with U.S. and Canada, that we as Native people, we enjoy the rights of dual citizenship of Canada and the United States. Well, that's not true either. Now, look, I'm not saying you can't be a dual citizen. I mean, there are people who can carry a passport from, a country of origin or a country they've patriated to and that kind of stuff. And I don't know how many countries say, well, we won't allow you to be a citizen, a dual citizen of two countries. Maybe they all are okay with that. But none of those countries, none of the international community, including under some of the language of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, none go so far as to say, we will recognize you as a citizen of a native nation state. And in fact, the UN DRIP avoids that conversation. In fact, they suggest that, in the declaration, that they are not promoting statehood in terms of nation statehood. They're merely addressing what is the minimum standard for survival and dignity of Native people within countries that have basically taken over the colonial existence. So it's a complicated question. Yes, I will, and I will maintain that yes, we are still here. We aren't still here in the same manner that we were here 200 years ago, 500 years ago, before white man showed up. And that's not just about language or clothing. It's about how much we have been impacted by a dominant culture coming in and really, really impacting our lives, and directing our lives. I mean, we've lived under the gun, literally. We've had our children taken away. We've had our young women sterilized, by white doctors. I mean, we've everything, every definition that they have, or every one of the criterion they have for genocide, our people have experienced that, from murder to sterilization to taking our children to creating the conditions that would make us cease to exist. All of those things qualify as genocide, and that has been and continues to be. Because we're still in this. We're still in this effort to assimilate us. And I'm going to take a break here and come back in a few minutes. When I come back, I want to talk about what is still the pressure to assimilate us, and the battles that we have over how we are perceived by governing authorities, by agencies, by elected officials, and frankly, by law enforcement, all of that stuff. We're still mired in this battle to assert our distinction. So we'll take a break and we'll come right back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Hey, thanks for coming back. Hey, I want to mention this is our 500th episode. And look, we've had some more shows than that, but since we, opened up our own studio and we began to log these shows numerically, this is essentially show number 500. So it's a bit of a milestone for us. And of course, we started out as a once a week 2-hour show. Then we changed it to a twice a week 1-hour show. And I'm going to say, starting with 501, our 501st episode, we're going to change the format again. We're going to go to doing 3 half-hour podcasts, and we're going to try that for a while. We'll see how that works out. It'll be 3 programs per week that you will get sent in your RSS feed as a podcast, and of course we'll put it up as videos. But it's a shorter. There'll be shorter shows, more concise to the topic that we're talking about, and we still plan to have guests and that kind of stuff. So nothing's going to change other than we aren't going to drag it out for a full hour, and we'll see how that works for a while. And if we'll see what it does with our listenership and that kind of stuff. I want to remind people this is a podcast. Yes, we shoot video and we put the video up on our YouTube channel, but I also do a radio show. And I do a show that we call Resistance Radio. It's on WBAI in New York City, on WPFW in Washington. But we also take that and we put it up as a podcast. I've mentioned this before, but Resistance Radio isn't listed with our Let's Talk podcast. So you have to search for Resistance Radio with John and Regan as a podcast. And subscribe to that. I encourage you to do it. We do some good shows. I can't say enough about Regan DeLoggins, who is my co-host. I hope to have her join us on a couple of these programs as well. But by all means, check out Resistance Radio with Regan and John, or John and Regan, I'm sorry, and make sure that you subscribe to this podcast. That way, you don't have to look for us. We'll come to you. If you subscribe to our podcast, it'll just get delivered to your phone or your tablet or whatever, and we'll deliver to you. You don't have to come looking for us. So I just wanted to mention that, and the fact that we're going to change up the format a little bit, starting with our next episode. All right, let me get back to it here. One of the things that has changed in this, with all of this assimilation, is how dependent we are on not just American democracy. I'm not getting away from the politics of it all, which we do get sucked into that, but certainly the system, the capitalist system, the how the economy and commerce works in the United States. We are much more integrated into that system, even as we've developed economically, casinos and smoke shops and gas stations and that kind of stuff, whatever other products and services we sell. We have immersed ourselves more completely into the U.S. marketplace. Now, we also have had a tradition of being farmers, and hunters, gatherers. You hear that all the time historically, and we still have some of that skill set. But even as we tried to grow our farms, coming out of over 100 years ago, we started meeting some of the complications about bringing our products to market. And many of the farms, were challenged. They were challenged by FDA regulations, USDA, agricultural regulations, whether we were selling milk, or products or whatever. So our existence has become a lot more, like I said, involved, engrossed, enmeshed with the U.S. Free market system, right? During the Great Depression, many Native people didn't feel the same impacts from the economic collapse because we were not that engaged in the U.S. economy. We grew much of our own food. We maintained a lot of our own needs. We had more community interaction about not just bartering, but just the idea of our commerce looked different. Put it that way, and I'm not criticizing the fact that we have grown out our economies, but it is a fact that we have now become, somewhat, enslaved to the market system. And, a lot of the things that we do because we have a regulatory advantage, and whether it's a tax advantage or, the fact that because our lands aren't taxed, that we can perhaps produce certain things, at a cheaper rate. So the outside systems have really impacted how we live today. I will say that we live a more affluent lifestyle. So, but that gets measured in dollars and cents. Today, we are probably, not by many measures as impoverished as we were in previous years. But having said that, that's not to say that our quality of life has improved. Because if you're only measuring poverty in dollars and cents, which is how you kind of measure it, because even when you talk about the cost of living, it's measured in dollars and cents. I would dare say that we lived, even as white people surrounded us and came to dominate our environment, so to speak, we still lived a quality of life that was both culturally appropriate, and maintained a fairly high quality. As we got more dependent on the dollars that we brought into our territories, and not just in the economies that we chose, but even the funding that was provided by the state or federal government on various things, these things put us in a situation where we become dependent on that. Now, the problem is the United States is in a state of decline. And there's no denying it. I mean, and this isn't because of 4 years of Trump or any of that other stuff. Look, the United States has been in a state of decline for a very long time. And part of it is the falseness of the economy and how it was for many years they could just raise more money by appropriating more lands from native people. It was one of these ways that you could get a free boost to your economy. You just expand your land holdings. And so there's this idea that this false propping up of the US economy, it was gonna bust at some point. You know, and we're seeing that. We're seeing consumption at a level that is unsustainable. Right now, the stock market of the United States is at an all-time high, but everybody knows that it's inflated and the bubble's gonna bust. They just don't know when. And in fact, one of the things that's come out in the news recently is how detached the value of a stock of a company is to the performance of a company. You know, GameStop comes to mind. You know, there's all these. It's become more and more clear that much of the stock market is a bit of a Ponzi scheme. So when the stock market crashes again, and it will, and they'll have all these kind of, you know, mechanisms to try to stop it from crashing terribly. But as that comes down to reality, we're also faced with the idea that the United States economy is not doing that well, and it's not just because of COVID-19. There has been, you know, the gap between the wealthy and the poor has grown dramatically. And even as, you know, guys like Donald Trump or Obama or anybody else, look, coming out of what was considered the crash or the recession of 2008, all this boasting about how great the economy was doing during the Obama administration. Well, look, a lot of people lost their homes. And what that means is that somebody made money off of those homes. So the rich got richer, the poor got poorer. That's unsustainable, especially since the rich rely on the poor to buy their stuff. And that money doesn't come out of thin air. Oh, sure, it's handed down family to family generationally. But in order to keep that money flowing, they rely on the rest of us. So the United States is really showing where it's going. We see not only the economy doing poorly, you know, unemployment at, you know, I know they say the level comes down, but it's because of the way they measure unemployment. The income gap is as ever widening. Fewer and fewer people hold a larger and larger stake of the American wealth. You know, so this is a problem. We see, you know, degradation in the social climate and in how people get along. We see, you know, obviously factionalism politically. There's global conflicts, there are political conflicts, there's social unrest, and of course there's the climate problem. So there's a lot of things, and of course throw into the mix, you know, a global pandemic that frankly the United States is a long ways from containing it. In fact, by most measures, the United States has been a dismal failure in its handling of COVID-19, and this isn't necessarily a once in a lifetime event. There have been, you know, diseases, there have been infections, there have been pandemics in the past. And as some of this other stuff unravels, including, you know, climate change, this may be more and more reoccurring. And that's not even talking about, you know, the existing pandemic, you know, just mutating, you know, to different versions of itself. So, look, that sounds pretty doom and gloom. I said it wasn't going to be about doom and gloom. That does sound pretty gloomy. But I guess the question has to be is, where does this leave us? As the United States continues to experience its state of decline and its unraveling of everything from its, you know, government to its economy to its, again, to the social unrest, where does it leave us? Well, look, we should be able to peel back and become, create more insulation or isolation from some of the unrest that's happening everywhere else. The question is, do we have the will to do it? So when I ask that question, yeah, but what are we? But what are we? I got to ask, where do we see ourselves? You know, with the United States being in its state of decline, we can be just like the proverbial, frog in a pot of water. We don't jump out because the water gets hot gradually, and by the time we realize that we're essentially being boiled to death, it's too late. So not just Native people, but many people are recognizing the problems that exist in the United States. Part of the anarchist movement is not necessarily to I don't think anybody realistically thinks that the United States can exist under a complete state of anarchy, but communities can. And by anarchy, I don't mean chaos. And I know that's how some people try to define it. But anarchy is about eliminating hierarchy. Lo and behold, that sounds familiar from a Native standpoint, because we had eliminated hierarchy under the Guyana-Ogoga. So if we began to say, look, we're going to treat our communities, and certainly non-Native people can do the same things. You isolate yourself from the party politics, from all that. Look, there's a small city out near Albany called Troy, New York, and I know Troy. I've been there. They prided themselves, and I haven't really experienced it, but they've prided themselves in almost removing the bipartisan, and the party bickering. They exist as a community first. Before, and I don't know if they run for office, without parties or anything, but I was listening to a program and they're talking about that. Now, the other thing that I've heard about is these things called transition towns, which are usually led through grassroots movements. This idea of trying to create communities that exist without the staying away from peak oil, trying to do more bartering, staying away from being a slave to the capitalist system in the United States. Now, this can happen at the smaller levels. Now, it never can happen completely, because we're at a place in our lives or in our development, I guess, as human beings, that we probably can't provide all of the infrastructure, from a transition town standpoint, or from an anarchy standpoint. There are some things that that we're going to rely on the existing marketplace for, but we can diminish it. We can ratchet it down somewhat. And we as Native people, we're in the best place because we actually have defined borders, right? We have territories that we can say the line is here, that you're no longer in the county or in the state, or and I would argue in the United States. So if and this isn't just about a resurgence of Native culture, but it's a part of it. But part of it is also realizing that our dependency on casino revenue or on a retail economy, that may be something that we've got to move in a different direction. Look, I'm encouraged by some of the food sovereignty movements that exist, but we've got to go beyond just growing corn, and many territories have, including this one. But the whole idea of trying to live with a bigger emphasis on community, and by community, I don't just mean neighborhood or village, because the world that we live in, we can connect with each other even miles and miles apart. So we can have communities that exist not just virtually, but we can have relationships that are community-like, that stretch across from territory to territory, from region to region. This is the kind of stuff that, and I've talked about some of this on previous programs, but I recognize that we are not the people we used to be. And while there's many of us that are trying to hang on to much of that characteristic of who we once were, we are met with tremendous obstacles that are always trying to assimilate us. And some of that assimilation comes in I've talked about gaming here. I mean, the state's pulled $1.5 billion out of Seneca Gaming. And so, yeah, we're going to work with you to in terms of authorizing your right to do gaming, whether we need it or not. But we're also going to create a condition where we're going to get paid. Well, that whole relationship is very much assimilation. The way that our kids are educated, we haven't taken enough of that responsibility on ourselves. So our kids are immediately inundated with pledging allegiance to the flag. you know, singing national anthems and patriotic hymns like, God bless America and America the beautiful and this land is your land and all that stuff, right? We don't, we have to overcome some of that stuff with our kids. And we have to maintain, I'm not saying that we've got to maintain an identity that exactly parallels who we were 100, 200 years ago. But we have to maintain some of that level of distinction. And I'm not saying because if we don't, we're going to be overrun. When I said I'm not going to be speak out doom and gloom, I've heard lots of people say, "Look, if you don't have your language, you run the risk of losing your land." I don't know. There's a direct line between those two things. I think if you cease to exist as the people you once were, it is going to be harder and harder to distinguish where your community, where their community ends and your community begins. I've heard many people say, everything is a pathway to them taxing our lands. That's not my concern. You know what I'm concerned about? I'm concerned about us taxing our lands. Us being so drawn to the systems out there that we bring those systems in because we're already doing it. We've seen it with tribal police. We've seen it with tribal courts. We've seen it with sometimes when we have done schooling, even Head Start and daycare. We adopt everything outside there and bring it in. Child Protective Services. So all of these, even some of the regulatory stuff, the licensing that we do, how we here in Seneca Territory, there's a stamp they put on cigarettes. Why? That's what they do out there. In somebody's infinite wisdom, they thought if the Seneca Nation stamped their cigarettes, that somehow it validated their conducting a commerce that doesn't pay to the state. You know what the state's view is? The state still has the opinion that they have the right to collect taxes on the sales that we conduct on our territories, as if they're sales to Americans. I mean, they don't enforce it. It's virtually impossible to enforce it. But it's important that we understand what their view is. And even if we seem to be getting away with something, doesn't mean that it can't come crashing to an end at some point. We look, every 7 to 10 years, we end up in a major conflict with the state over things like taxation. And the less distinction, I don't want to be in that situation that the St. Regis Mohawk tribe was in, where they tried to defend themselves using, some sort of, whether it's a treaty or who we once were, that we don't seem to be much of that anymore. I don't want a white man in a black robe telling me, well, you're not who you used to be, so we don't have to recognize this or recognize that. They don't recognize it anyway, but when that becomes their argument, look, there was a period of time in the relationship between the United States and Native people that was called the termination era. That's when the federal government says we no longer have to maintain a trust relationship with you because you have now been assimilated. You are no longer distinct. And this termination era was a means, again, it was forced assimilation. I mean, even some of the laws, like the the Indian Citizenship Act that I talked about, this was, again, by any historical account, a war crime. The idea of diminishing or trying to strip away our national or cultural character and imposing the U.S. character upon us. But you see, we don't have that conversation. Many people will actually cite 1924 as the date that we were allowed to be U.S. citizens. I mean, here's the reality. The United States can't deprive us of any of the constitutional rights that they provide their own people, because we predate their existence. They can't ignore the fact that we're here and say that even if I maintain as I do that I'm not a U.S. citizen, it doesn't mean that they can somehow treat me less legally. They do treat Native people and other people of color less, but they don't do it based on having the legal right to do it. They do it because racism is embedded in the systems. So they don't have to acknowledge it. They can just do it. without ever having to acknowledge that we are the victims of systemic racism. See, therein lies part of the problem. So again, I think it's important that we realize that no, we're not necessarily the bottom isn't going to drop out and one day the United States isn't going to come in and say, oh, you cease to exist. But the problem is the more that we incorporate their systems on our territory, I mean, it's like the final pages of Animal Farm, the George Orwell book. You look and all of a sudden you look at the pigs and you look at the man and you can't tell the difference between the two. Well, in this situation, we're the pigs and they're the man. Or we could reverse it, I guess. But at some point, if we're not careful, we are not going to be able to distinguish ourselves from that. And we already see it. I mean, we see it with our people running for offices and our people enlisting in their military, becoming their police officers, becoming their politicians. And then they become the systems of oppression that we face. And look, I've seen even in native governance, tribal government, and I use the word because I'm not a fan of it. I'm using it to be derogatory, where native people have used sitting on a native council, sitting on a board within one of our territories as a stepping stone to running for state office. And then that's stepping stone being their ability or their popularity growing to where they can run for national office. I've seen our people use our systems to elevate themselves in their systems. I've seen it all the time. And I'm not just talking about increasing their economic worth, but this is the challenges that we have. So yeah, I think in another 100 years we'll still say we're still here, but it's going to be increasingly difficult to understand who we are when we say that. And I don't think it's impossible to say it now. But as we look at the world around us and we look at some of what is deteriorating in terms of climate and politics and all that stuff, we better be more aware of where we stand in that dynamic. And I'm not saying this to sound like Armageddon's coming, but this isn't just about protecting ourselves from from disaster. It's about planning for our future, for our own prosperity. And perhaps right along the way, we create models that other people will follow. They've used our models before. They didn't just use our land. They did incorporate some of our systems as they carved out their American dream. The question is always going to be, what do we see our vision of our future for, I should say. And one of the things that I've got to say that I become more and more concerned when I see some of the euphoria over Joe Biden getting elected, or Deb Haaland being the Interior Secretary, or I talked recently about the Fed wrecking of Hawaii. I see a lot more pushback from Native people saying, that's not so bad. Yeah, she's going to be good for us. Or what would be wrong with being recognized, getting federally recognized? When I talked about it 10 years ago, I had a lot more people who agreed with me. Today, I'm meeting more resistance today than I met 10 years ago with some of the same conversations. Now, I'm not saying that I've lost everybody, but I'm saying people are becoming more vocally supportive of those systems of colonization, those systems of assimilation. So it wears down on you, and this is kind of where we're at. So I think we do have to ask the question, what is it that we want to be? Who, as we maintain our distinction, how much distinction will we maintain? As we maintain our autonomy, is it just going to be autonomy, but still exactly like what's out there? Because that's not really who we were. The question is, who will we be? That's the question I want to ask. I want to thank you for listening. Most of this is just food for thought. So let's think about it. I look forward to your comments, and we'll do some follow-up on it. So I want to thank you for listening. Look forward to 3 shorter podcasts, starting next week, and we'll see how that goes. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.